In our Blazor project, to-do-app client in the program.cs class, we already have an HTTP client configured, which allows us to inject this service into a component and call the appropriate endpoint. However, configuring the HTTP client as scoped is not the best practice, as it can cause several issues. It is better to use the HTTP client factory, and for this purpose, we first call the addHTTP client method, which registers the factory, and then we create the client as scoped. See how such an implementation should look. So instead we create builder, services, and now addHTTP client. But to use this, we need to install the Microsoft.extensions.http library via NuGet. So we will install such a library here. Okay, and now we can use this method and pass the first parameter as the name we will refer to. So todo app API. Next, we want to add configuration using a lambda expression to set the base address. And here we want to get this address from our configuration, which is from the app settings.json file, specifically from the API configuration base address. And we want to set it here. So new URI and now builder configuration, and we first provide the name API configuration, then a colon and base address. Okay. However, as you probably saw, we have our API available at the base address, but we always append API to the name of the controller. So our endpoints, the entire URL, are usually configured in such a way that they first have the base address URL, then API, and then the name of the controller, which in this case is task. In connection with this, we can append API to the base URL here, so we won't have to add it each time in the methods calling specific endpoints. Okay? We can also configure a timeout of 5 minutes, so a time span of 5 minutes. Okay? And now, thanks to this method, we have added the HTTP client factory, and now we need to create a client. At this point, we can use add scope. As I mentioned, we will be creating a client here. So service type, get service, HTTP client factory, create client, and now we need to specify the name from this place. This is the best way to always use the HTTP client in a Blazor WebAssembly application. And now, with the configuration ready, we could inject the HTTP client implementation directly into the component. However, the best practice is to create a separate layer for such a new service, where all the endpoint calls from the web API using the HTTP client will be. This way, we will have organized code and easier usage. We will also be able to operate on interfaces, and we can use our services in any components. So I will create a new folder in our client. I will name it HTTP repository. The naming here can be arbitrary. This is just what I use. Next, inside, I will add a folder called interfaces, and I will add the first interface, iTask repository. I will also immediately add the implementation, task repository. It will implement the iTask repository interface, and here we will use the HTTP client. So I'll inject it here through the constructor and save it in the client field. Now, in this interface and implementation, we'll have all the methods that will work with the web API. This means they will call various endpoints from our web API. So we'll have everything in one place. However, we still need to register this service. So builder, services, add scoped, iTask repository, task repository. This means that wherever we use the task repository, we want to inject task repository. And we'll inject this into components where we need to call some endpoints from the web API. Of course, if this application were more complex, we would have more repositories. However, in our case, there will be only one. Great, I'll go ahead and rebuild our application. I'll check if we have any errors. Great, everything is okay. We also have prepared helper classes, thanks to which we will be able to consume the API. And now, I invite you to the next lesson, in which we will implement adding new tasks.